What's up guys, Asian here with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Warden DPS. Unfortunately, Magicka Wardens have kind of a bad spot when it comes to DPS, at least on the Magicka side of things. Stamina Wardens are still pretty decent. They can pull pretty comparative numbers to other stamina classes, but Magicka Wardens just aren't able to pull the same level of DPS as other Magicka classes. They consistently get outparsed by Magplars, Magsorks, all the other Magicka specs consistently outperform Magicka Wardens. That doesn't mean that Magicka Wardens are necessarily bad DPS. You can still pull vet level, vet trials ready DPS using a Magicka Warden. It's just a lot more difficult to do so, and requires a little bit of creative thinking in order to get up to that level. But today I will be showing you guys a non-pet Magicka Warden build that is capable of pulling Vet Trials DPS with a little bit of practice and a little bit of gear optimization. So just like with our other build videos, we'll be talking about our gear, talking about CP point distribution, our ability bars, talk about some alternatives for the gear and the abilities that I have right now. They're going to talk about a rotation a little bit, kind of go over skill prioritization, what to do if you have to break out of your rotation. And then we'll be finishing things off with a 6 million dummy Parse, so you guys can get an idea of the level of DPS that a Magicka Warden can pull. So starting things off with gear, we will be going with 2-piece Nerien'eth, 1 medium and 1 heavy, both with Magicka enchants. So because Nerien'eth gives us a max health boost with the 1-piece effect, we can actually use Witchmother's Potent Brew, which will boost our health up to 16,700 or so. So if you do want to hit 17k max health, you're going to have to put a little bit of effort into it. You're going to have to put some points into health or take some out of Magicka, or you can replace one of these Magicka enchants on your small pieces with a health enchant, and that will put you at 17k health. So it's kind of a play by ear. You do have access to a shield, so you do have more survivability compared to stamina classes, but you still want to have some more health in order to help pad you against some of the larger hits that you might have to experience in vet trials. For our 5-piece, we are going with Scathing Mage. For those of you guys who don't know what Scathing Mage is, it is a light armor set that comes out of the Imperial City prison, so you do need to have the Imperial City DLC in order to get this set. If you don't have access to Imperial City DLC, or you don't want to farm for Scathing Mage, you can use Julianos instead. Scathing Mage will beat out Julianos if you get above 58% uptime on Scathing Mage. So Julianos will give you more consistent DPS because Scathing Mage is a proc set, so you're not guaranteed to get 58% or higher uptime depending on how lucky you are with your RNG. So Scathing Mage's bonuses gives you max Magicka, 2 spell crit bonuses, and then when you deal direct critical damage, you have a 20% chance to increase your spell damage by 516 for 6 seconds. This effect can occur once every 6 seconds, which basically means there's no cooldown on it, so you can proc it immediately after 6 seconds or up if RNG decides to favor you. Now when it says direct critical damage, it basically means it'll proc off of a critical hit, but that critical hit needs to come from a direct damage ability. It won't proc off of something like Blockade of Storms, which is considered a damage over time ability, so that's kind of the downside of using Scathing Mage. We will be using Infallible Aether. You can go with Willpower or Moondancer or Master Architect. All 3 of those pieces will pull a little bit higher DPS. It's not really significant. We are using Infallible Aether here for that extra spell crit chance in order to help us proc Scathing Mage a little bit more and get a little bit more out of Scathing Mage. But like I said, you can use the other minor Slayer sets or Willpower. We will be using 3 spell damage glyphs. You can replace one of them with a regen glyph. You'll see a small drop in DPS, but you'll have much better sustain as a result of this. Magicka Wardens do have access to a pretty good sustain through their Blue Betty, but it is always nice to have some additional sustain. For our front bar, we're going with an Asylum's Perfected Inferno staff. You can go infused or precise. Precise will help you maintain your Scathing Mage uptime, but infused will get you more DPS out of your shock damage enchant. We are going with shock damage to help maintain our concussed uptime, but with a Perfected Inferno staff, you can reasonably go with a fire damage enchant instead to give yourself a little bit more DPS. You can go with the non-perfect Inferno staff, and if you do decide to go with non-perfect, you will probably have to stick with the shock damage enchant in order to maintain concussed uptime. For our back bar, we're going with a Maelstrom Lightning staff with a weapon damage enchant. So just like our front bar, you can go with Precise in order to help proc Scathing Mage, or you can go with Nirn or Infused in order to give yourself a little bit more DPS that way. So you can actually use Sharpened on your front or your back bar. Just keep in mind that if you go over the penetration cap of 18,200 when you have Sharpened, it is going to be a DPS loss compared to these other traits here. So before we move on, I kind of want to discuss why we're using Scathing Mage and Nerien'eth, because both of these proc off of direct damage. Now this is not something that a lot of people know, at least from the people that I've discussed with. So Force Shock, let's quickly go over here to Force Pulse. So Crushing Shock and Force Pulse, when you use it, it'll deal 3 direct damage hits. The Flame damage, the Frost damage, and the Shock damage hits all count as direct damage. When you have the Concentrated Force set proc, when it applies Burning, Concussed, and Chilled, those 3 procs will count as direct damage as well. Even though Burning is considered a dot, the first tick of Burning counts as direct damage. So you can get 6 direct damage hits with an Asylum Inferno staff when you get that proc off. Now the shock damage enchant also counts as direct damage, so that you can get up to 7. And if you want to count the light attack, because you will be light attack weaving, there's your 8th source of direct damage. So you're getting a lot of direct damage just off of Force Pulse and your shock damage enchant alone. Now there's also Fletcher Infection. So while it seems like Fletcher Infection is a dot, it actually counts as direct damage. So we're not sure if this is a bug like it was with Twisting Path on Nightblades, or if it's working as intended. We haven't really heard anything from Zos. I haven't managed to dig anything up on the official forums about this. So for right now, we're just going to assume that they're not going to change it. So we're going to take advantage of this and use Scathing Mage and Nerien'eth, because we do end up getting an additional direct damage tick from Fletcher Infection. So that's why we're using Nerien'eth and Scathing Mage. Now onward with the rest of our build. We're putting 64 points into Magicka. You can put a couple of points into health in order to hit 17k health, because we are using Witchmother, so we do have a little bit lower health. But that's kind of up to you. Again, you can put a health enchant on a small piece if you would like, in order to hit that health threshold. For our Mundus stone, we're going to be going with the Apprentice. You can go with the Lover for 4-man content or solo stuff like VMA or Overland questing. However, in 12-man content, Apprentice is going to pull ahead, especially if with Lover you go above the spell penetration cap of 18,200. Again, if you go over that, it is a DPS loss, so Apprentice is going to win out in that regard. Now we are a vampire. I will probably stick as a stage 4 vampire just because I'm too lazy to feed every time I need to do a raid. But you only need to be stage 2 in order to get the regen boost. So if you do decide to stay stage 4, do remember that you will take 25% more damage from fire. So just watch out for that if you decide not to feed and to go down to stage 2 vampirism. And like I said, we are using Witchmothers. And now in terms of race, I am a Dark Elf. I am a Dunmer, so I get 9% extra Magicka, 7% extra flame damage, and 2% extra shock and frost damage. Altmer, the High Elves, are another good choice for race. They get 10% additional Magicka, 9% Magicka regen, and they get 4% to frost, shock, and flame damage. So they're a little bit more balanced. Wardens do have some sources of frost damage, so Altmer will pull a little bit ahead of Dunmer in this regard. Another potential race choice you can go for is Bretons. They get 10% additional max Magicka. They do get some spell resistance, so they are a little bit more survivable in certain content because they will take less damage from spells. And they have a little bit of a sustain boost because they do have 3% off their Magicka ability cost. So Bretons are another good choice to make. And kind of a dark horse for races is actually Argonians. You get 5% additional health and 5% additional Magicka, so you actually won't need to use health enchants or put attribute points into health if you are an Argonian. So that's a nice bonus to have. And then there you have your potion passive. So whenever you drink a potion with an Argonian, you get max Magicka, you get restore Magicka, health, and stamina. So that's a really nice boost to your sustain. So that's kind of why Argonians are kind of overlooked for Magicka DPS. But that potion sustain really helps out, and that extra health does mean you get to basically maximize everything else into Magicka. So you don't have to put any points or health enchants. So that's always nice to have as well. As for our ability bars, for our front bar, I will not actually be using Elemental Drain. We will be using Harness Magicka instead in Trial. Fletcher Infection, Crushing Shock, you can use Force Pulse. Force Pulse will give you a little bit more DPS. Inner Light, and we're using Stalwart Guard. And our ultimate's going to be Northern Storm. You won't necessarily be using this for damage. This is mainly here for the 8% passive boost to your max Magicka. Northern Storm does provide major protection when it's up. It has a 10-meter radius, so it is fairly large. It's about comparable to Nova, and it does provide major protection. So that it will actually stack with, I believe Nova gives you Major Maim, which reduces enemy damage dealt by 30%, so it will stack with Nova. So if you are going for strats that require major protection or major Maim, Northern Storm does provide that, so it is a nice bonus to have on it. But you won't really be using Northern Storm for the damage component. For our back bar, we're going with Lotus Blossom, Blue Betty, Blockade of Storms, Winter's Revenge, and we have the double bar Stalwart Guard, and our main damage ultimate is going to be Thunderous Rage. So I don't have all these skills leveled up just yet, so we will see a little bit of a DPS loss, but not that big of a deal when we do our Parse. So we are going to be using Stalwart Guard. This build is built around providing some group support, so that's why we're using Lotus Blossom and Stalwart Guard. So Stalwart Guard, you will take 30% damage to the person that you are guarding. So if they take, for example, a 10,000 damage hit, instead of taking 10,000 damage, they will take 7,000 damage, and you will take that 3,000 damage instead for them. So that's something you want to keep in mind with Stalwart Guard. So you're not going to be using this on a melee DPS, partially because they are a little bit squishier and you don't want to take too much unnecessary damage, but also because Stalwart Guard provides minor force, and Stamina DPS typically use Rearming Trap, which provides minor force already, so you can't double up on minor force that way. So you're going to be guarding a Magicka DPS instead, one of your ranged DPS buddies. So ranged DPS do have shields, so they are going to be more survivable, and you also have a shield, so that'll help maintain your own survivability. And most Magicka DPS aren't going to have a native source of minor force. Templars and Nightblades, while they have a class passive that boosts their critical damage, it's not considered minor force, but it will stack with that. So Stalwart Guard is very nice. It gives you and your person that you're guarding minor force, which is a nice boost to your DPS. There is a radius, however, to it. There is a range of 15 meters, so if you do have to move apart for any sort of mechanic, for example against Zastasha, if your partner happens to get cursed and has to run to a cleansing pad, you will have to reapply Stalwart Guard, so do keep that in mind. If you are going to be using Stalwart Guard, you're going to have to want to talk with your raid lead because of that 15-meter radius. You will want to be next to the person that you're going to be guarding, and obviously you're going to want to guard somebody who is well aware of mechanics and won't stand, as we say, in stupid, because you will be taking any sort of 30% of the damage that they're taking. So if you're guarding somebody who likes to stand in red, probably going to want to pick somebody else to guard. So do keep that in mind when you're deciding who you want to guard. So talk with your raid lead, say, hey, I am running Stalwart Guard. I want to guard somebody. Who do you have any recommendations? And if you are going to be using some sort of positioning guide, make sure I'm always next to them in the positioning guide, so I will be able to guard them. But if you don't want to use Stalwart Guard, if you don't trust your fellow raid members to not give you too much damage, then you will swap out these abilities. So for your back bar, you would be using Inner Light instead, and on your front bar, you would be using Bird of Prey. So we'll be using Bird of Prey mainly for the minor berserk uptime. This is very useful for trials where you're not necessarily going to get all that much combat prayer. For example, in that Asylum, you might be running around too much, so you won't necessarily be getting 100% uptime on combat prayer, so it's nice to maintain your own minor berserk. Plus you get an additional 2% damage done due to the advanced species passive while you're on your front bar, so that's always a nice boost to have. And then of course we have Inner Light on our back bar just for that 5% additional Magicka from Inner Light, plus the additional 2% from the Mage's Guild passive, so it's 7% additional Magicka, so that just helps boost all of our abilities as well. So one thing I do want to make note of is you don't actually need to use spell power potions if you're running this particular build, because Lotus Blossom will give you major prophecy and Blue Betty will give you major sorcery. So you actually can use crafted restore magicka potions using something like mountain flower and cornflower instead, which ends up saving you some money because mountain flower is cheaper to purchase than lady smock. Or you can use the standard essence of magicka that you get from overworld drops instead. That will give you a lower uptime on major sorcery, but it's a lot cheaper to get because those potions you can just farm them off of like a public dungeon or something. So that's kind of a benefit of using Blue Betty and Lotus Blossom. So that's something you want to keep in mind as well. So just remember that your crafted Restore Magicka potions will give you Major Intellect for 47 seconds, while the dropped Essence of Magicka will give you Major Intellect for, I believe it's 28 seconds? Yeah, 28 seconds. So you will get more uptime with Major Intellect if you use your own crafted potions. So that's something you want to keep in mind when you're deciding which potion to use. Now onward to our CPs. We have 75 into Arcanus and 75 into Tenacity, which leaves us 80 points, which can be split up into these next 3 nodes however you'd like. I like a balanced approach, so I have 26 into Warlord, 26 into Tumbling, and 28 into Shadow Ward. You can divide those up however you'd like. For our blue CP, I have 34 into Elfborn, 49 into Elemental Expert, and 38 into Spell Erosion. More on this in a little bit. 34 into Master at Arms, and 75 into Thaumaturge. Now, just like with using Lover and Sharpened, if you're going to want to make sure that you're not going over the spell pen cap when you put points into Spell Erosion. This particular CP setup is optimized for the raid group that I run with, where we get Elemental Drain, Power of the Light, and Infused Thorax Crusher. We won't necessarily get Alkosh all the time. We don't primarily run Alkosh, I should say. So that's why I have a lot of points into Spell Erosion. So if you do have Alkosh in the group, then you're obviously not going to need all that money to all these points into Spell Erosion. So you can take those out and put them back into Master at Arms and Elfborn. So if you need to move points into Spell Erosion, take them out of Elfborn and then Master at Arms first. Because even though we are running higher crit chance compared to other Magicka DPS, Elfborn will still have the least amount of impact on your DPS overall, especially because we will be using Guard for that additional 10% additional crit damage. So you want to take out of Elfborn first, and then Master at Arms. You definitely don't want to touch Elemental Expert or Thaumaturge, just because you want to keep Thaumaturge for the Exploiter passive, and you want to keep Elemental Expert because that's a flat boost to basically all of your damage abilities. So that's something you want to keep in mind. So for our red CPs, the distribution that I have is a one-size-fits-most scenario. Depending on the content you're running, you might need to put more points into other nodes. You might need to redistribute these around. For example, in Hell Ra, you'll be taking more physical damage, so you might want to move points out of Elemental Defender and put them into Hardy. So do keep that in mind when you're deciding red CPs. It will cost you 3,000 gold every time you want to redistribute, so it might be better just to take a one-size-fits-most approach like I have here. I have 48 into Ironclad, 44 into Thickskin, 49 into Hardy and Elemental Defender, and 40 into Bastion. I have a couple more points into Bastion compared to other Magicka DPS builds that I have, but because we are using Stalwart Guard, so you will want that extra shield in order to help out your survivability. So with all that done and said, we're going to start going over our rotation and kind of the mindset behind it. So before we start, I'm going to swap out my shield for Elemental Drain for the Parse we're going to do eventually. So, skill prioritization. You're going to want to maintain basically all of your dots, more or less. Obviously, you're going to want to maintain Stalwart Guard, so if you are moved 15 meters away from whoever you are guarding, when you get back into your position, make sure to find that person and guard them again to make sure you get that Minor Force uptime. And then from there, basically most of these skills you're going to want to maintain up at all times. I know that sounds kind of a lot to ask for, but that's just the truth because each skill provides something very useful. So Lotus Blossom provides additional heals, and plus your Major Prophecy buff. Blue Betty helps out with your regen because it restores your magicka over time, plus it gives you major sorcery. Blockade is going to be a major source of DPS as well as Winter's Revenge. And then you want obviously to keep up Bird of Prey for minor berserk, and then you're going to want to keep up Fletcher Infection for that direct damage hits, so you can help maintain your procs on Nerien'eth and Scathing Mage. So all of these abilities that you're using have a specific use, and they're you're going to want to try to maintain all of them if you can. So if you do have to break out of your rotation to res somebody, for me personally, the two skills that I definitely want to maintain at all times are going to be Blue Betty for the regen and Stalwart Guard for the minor force. From there, you're going to want to maintain Blockade and Winter's Revenge, followed by Fletcher Infection. You can let Bird of Prey drop off if you're using Bird of Prey, because you can get minor berserk from combat prayer, so there is that aspect of it, so you don't necessarily need to keep Bird of Prey up. And then Lotus Blossom is probably the lowest priority out of all these skills. While the heal is nice and you get Major Prophecy, if you're using Essence of Spell Power, you'll have Major Prophecy, and you obviously have your healers for healing, so you don't necessarily need to maintain Lotus Blossom at all times. So Lotus Blossom is going to be your lowest priority there. So for our rotation, our dots have varying duration. So Blockade of Storms lasts for 8 seconds, Winter's Revenge lasts for 12 seconds, Lotus Blossom lasts for 20 seconds, Blue Betty lasts for 27 seconds, Bird of Prey lasts for 14 seconds, Fletcher Infection lasts for 10 seconds. So it's a very dynamic rotation. So much like the Magicka Nightblade, you'll be seeing a lot of bar swapping throughout parses, just because it's going to be a lot more of monitoring your dots and making sure you're maintaining them throughout the fight. So before you enter any fight, there's going to be a couple of constants though. You're obviously going to want to buff up with Blue Betty, Lotus Blossom. You're going to want to drink your potion, and then you're going to open up with your Destro Staff ulti. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to drink my potion, obviously I don't have my Destro ulti up. So Blue Betty, Lotus Blossom, drink your potion, drop your Destro ulti, and then put all your buffs up. And like I said, this is going to be a dynamic rotation. So you're not going to have a fixed rotation. Alright, so that's kind of, you can see there is no fixed rotation because all of our dots have varying lengths. So you're just going to want to maintain an eye on your Srendar or action duration reminder, and just make sure to maintain those buffs up at all time. The one skill that's going to be a little bit buggy with action duration reminder is going to be Fletcher Infection. Sometimes it'll work and sometimes it won't, so you're just going to want to keep an eye on it and use Srendar as a backup. So you might want to put Fletcher Infection on your prominent buff whitelist on Srendar, just so you can maintain it when action duration reminder doesn't work for Fletcher Infection. So you will need to have your attack in order to sustain. That's just kind of the nature of it. You won't be able to have sustain a dynamic rotation like this without heavy attacking. So what I like to do is whenever I lay down Blockade, I'd like to heavy attack afterward if I do need to sustain. So real quick. So for example, I would heavy attack here. If I have anything on this bar that I need to queue up, I'll do that. Then heavy attack here. So that's kind of how I like to weave in my heavy attacks. I like to do it after or right before a blockade. But you can really put it in wherever you would like, as long as it's on the back bar, because the Lightning Staff heavy attacks do deal more damage and just flows a lot easier compared to the Inferno Staff heavy attack. So it will restore more Magicka on your back bar, as well as deal more damage. It is slower than your Inferno Staff heavy attack, but the trade-off there is the Inferno heavy attack won't deal as much damage and it won't restore as much Magicka. So with all that in mind, because we do have a dynamic rotation, the best way to see it in action is just to do it. So I will be doing a 6 million dummy parse, and I will try to narrate what I'm doing throughout the parse so you guys can get an idea of what's important and the kind of the mindset as I go into throughout the fight. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with this 6 million W parse. I accidentally cast that a little bit too early. So, like I said, I am trying to keep an eye on all my dots, especially Fletcher Infection, because it is buggy on Action Duration Reminder. Hopefully you guys are able to see how I'm prioritizing all of my dots and my buffs. The nature of the rotation is that you will have some downtime on your buffs. That's just how dynamic rotation works. So there we go. That is our Magicka Warden Parse. So you can see there I was really focusing on maintaining all of my dots and all my buffs, making sure I wasn't overcasting them. I obviously ended up overcasting some of them. And just the nature of the dynamic rotation makes it a very active rotation. You have to really keep an eye on everything and make sure you aren't necessarily overcasting, and make sure you have your priority skills up at all times. So quickly going over our parse here, pulled 30.8k, so around 31k, which is vet trials ready. So remember that we did have to break our rotation up a little bit because we have to apply elemental drain. We are getting minor berserk, so there is that, but it's not necessarily a 100% uptime. You can see we got 88% uptime, so that is inflating our parse a little bit. So that's something you want to keep in mind, but this would be considered vet trial ready for several guilds. Maybe not the top end rating guilds like the ones that are doing competitive leaderboard runs, but for most other guilds this is pretty much, you're going to meet the DPS check for those guilds. So quickly looking over our combat metrics report. see that light attacks are going to make up a huge part of our DPS, so it's very important that you get those light weaves off. They make up almost 20% of our DPS, so combined it's 19.6%. And then, like I said, Winter's Revenge and Blockade of Storms are both pretty much going to be number 2 and number 3. They're going to trade positions every once in a while, so that's why you kind of want to try to maintain those, because they are a very large source of DPS here. Fletcher Infection 2 does provide a nice source of DPS, but again, the primary reason for Fletcher Infection that we're using it is because it does deal direct damage instead of damage over time, so it helps proc Nerien'eth as well as Scathing Mage. So if you look at Scathing Mage uptime, we have 59% uptime, which is just barely eking out above Julianos. So in this case, if we were to use Julianos instead, we'd probably get around the same Parse. So remember that Scathing Mage, in order for Scathing Mage to beat Julianos, the break-even point is 58% uptime. So this is just barely meeting that threshold. So in this case, Julianos would probably pull ahead. And that's kind of the danger of using a Scathing Mage as your main 5-piece set. You are kind of at the mercy of RNG when it comes to how many crits you're able to get. And kind of the same thing with your Nerien'eth proc. You can see here it only did 1,400 DPS, but I've seen this number be as high as 2,000 on some parses. So you really are at the mercy of RNG because of all these proc sets, and that's just kind of the unfortunate reality of it. Like I said, you could go with Julianos, but because Scathing Mage, with the setup that we currently have, you do have a good chance of going above that break-even point of 58% uptime. You will end up losing a little bit of DPS if you use Julianos, even though it will end up being a lot more consistent. So that's pretty much it for the Magicka Warden. So again, you can pull Vet Trials level DPS with the Magicka Warden. It's just going to take a little bit of fine-tuning, a lot of practice with your rotation, paying attention to your dots, Strendar and Action Duration Reminder, and a little bit of unique gear for your Magicka Warden. So don't be discouraged when people say Magicka Warden DPS sucks. It sucks compared to the other Magicka DPS, but when taking into consideration the amount of DPS that it can pull, it is definitely not a bad DPS class. So you can see here I can pull Vet Trials level DPS. It just takes a lot of practice in order to get to it. But yes, the Magicka Warden does do less damage overall compared to other classes. It loses out by anywhere between 3k to 4k. So I can consistently pull 35k on the rest of my Magicka DPS classes, or I should say at least 35k. So you can kind of see here that we are kind of 4k shy, so we're looking at about a 10 to 15% difference in DPS. So hopefully Zos will buff Magicka Wardens, because I do really enjoy the active playstyle and the support that the class itself provides, even as a DPS. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.